Okay, welcome. Thank you all for coming to the Neuroethics Symposium Stimulating the Self, Neurotechnology, Identity, and Agency. I want to thank our sponsors, the Program on Values, the Department of Philosophy, and the Center for Sensory Motor Neural Engineering here at UW, and especially Destin for helping us organize everything. For many years now, the Program on Values has been running a medical ethics symposium. We haven't done it absolutely every year, but many years. And our plan has been just to get a really interesting topic and bring together an interdisciplinary perspective on it. And so we always try to get three good, interesting scholars from outside UW and then three interesting local commentators. And we try to make sure that we mix things up so that we have, for instance, a philosopher commenting on a physician, a neuroscientist commenting on a philosopher, right? And just trying to get interdisciplinary conversations going by the way that we structure the system or the day's events. In the past, we've done symposia on things like dying hopes, on Alzheimer's care, we're going down memory lane with Cornell, on the migration of medical care workers as well as medical education, on the treatment of pain and suffering, on borderline personality disorder, on lots of different topics. And this year, we have it on neuroethics, particularly looking at deep brain stimulation and brain-computer interfaces and their potential effects on identity and agency. The symposium grows out of work that the Ethics Trust has done at the UW Center for Sensory Motor Neural Engineering. That center is aimed at making bidirectional brain-computer interfaces that mainly are focused on addressing issues of motor function, so for people with spinal cord injury or people who've had a stroke, some issues for people with Parkinson's or essential tremor. But there are others outside of our center that are working on these same sorts of devices for issues like psychiatric disorders, depression, or obsessive compulsive disorder, or epilepsy as well, other kinds of medical issues. The CSNE ethics group collaborates with engineers, neuroscientists, neurosurgeons to highlight and grapple with the values issues that occur within the research that's ongoing in that center. So hopefully not just looking at farther down the line implications of what comes out of it, but doing ethics and values work in the very earliest stages of the research. Now the idea of implanting semi-autonomous devices, right, that are going to run, or in the bidirectional case, run and have a feedback loop, and implanting them in our brains is daunting, if not threatening to many people, right? It's just, we tend to identify with our brains, even if not fully, that seems to be a central part of our identity. And so part of what we want to do today is look really carefully at what are some of the issues, not only that might be side effects of some of the neural technologies we're talking about, but also that are effects of them when they're functioning the way they're intended to function, that might just be further interesting effects about the way we understand ourselves, about the way we understand our responsibility for action, whether we see ourselves as doing the things that we are doing or as controlling some of the moods or thoughts that we have, or if we see ourselves as working with another entity that's within us in some way. So just to give a little background here, the DBS devices are used, deep brain stimulators are used primarily so far for people with Parkinson's disease or essential tremor. And they're actually quite effective in terms of stopping tremor. But some people, it's not the majority, some people who've had them have reported interesting identity side effects. So saying things like, I just don't feel like myself, or something doesn't feel quite right, or I'm not sure I identify with myself the way I did before following this surgery and having the device turned on. And others will have interesting effects like greater impulsivity following that, or greater gambling behavior, something like this. So this is against the backdrop of that. We want to look at how these devices might affect autonomy and agency, and also, given our first talk, how they might restore or bring back identity or autonomy or agency. So we have three speakers here today. External speakers invited in. I just want to introduce all three of them right now so you get a sense of where we're going. We have Dr. Joseph Finns, right here in front. He'll be the first one. He's a physician and a medical ethicist at the Cornell Weill Medical College. His recent work focuses on disorders of consciousness, looking particularly at people in minimally conscious states, as well as people diagnosed as being in vegetative states, where sometimes we're not maybe we shouldn't be as certain about that diagnosis as we are. And he has a fascinating book called Rights Come to Mind that offers a look at people in minimally conscious states and the rights that they might or should have recognized. And also the possibility that DBS might aid in their return to agency or in their communication. Dr. Aaron Klein will be a commentator for Dr. Finns. Aaron did a joint MD PhD program. His PhD's in philosophy. He's a practicing neurologist down in Oregon, but he comes up one day a week to work with us in the ethics thrust at the CSNE. And he's also an affiliate member of the philosophy faculty here. Our second talk will be from Dr. Françoise Baylis, who's coming to us from Dalhousie University. She's a chair in bioethics and philosophy. Her work is part of this interesting interdisciplinary research cluster, the Impact Ethics Group, that works at the intersection of health, bioethics, and public policy. And she's written papers that our group likes to use that use a relational autonomy frame, a feminist frame on what identity is, to think about both DBS and disability as things that can affect one's identity but not threaten it necessarily. And her commentator will be Dr. Andrew Coe, in the back of the room, a UW neurosurgeon, member of the CSNE research team. He's currently working on a study in the CSNE that looks at closed-loop DBS for Parkinson's and for what? For essential tremor, thank you, for essential tremor. And thinking about different control mechanisms, so whether or not the individual user of the device could control how the stimulation goes, or might even control it with their thinking right through a BCI. And then our final speaker for the afternoon will be Dr. Karen Rommelfinger. She's joining us from Emory University, where she's the neuroethics program director. She's a neuroscientist by training, now working in an ethics program at Emory, and also assistant professor in the Department of Neurology and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She's a member of the Brain Initiative's work group on ethics and an editor at Age of Neuroscience. And I have seen her give fascinating work on identity issues linked up with brain-to-brain interfaces, and that's one thing we'll hear about today. And her commentator will be Dr. Laura Sprecher-Sullivan, our own postdoc with the CSNE. She has a PhD in philosophy, and she's really been guiding our group on thinking about empirical research and qualitative analysis, although she clearly has her philosophy in the background there too. So I encourage you all to stay through the day. If you can't stay the whole time, we are also going to be videotaping the talk, so we'll try to make those available on just a local server, but given we have your emails, we'll get you access to that. There's coffee in the back if you need to stimulate yourself in other ways. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Finns.
Sarah, thank you so very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and have Aaron as my commentator and have friends from the neuroethics universe here for the day. It's a special treat. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the work that we've done with neuroimaging and deep brain stimulation, and talk about how these neuroprosthetics help people either be discovered to be there when we thought they weren't there, or to have them re-emerge through a kind of an intervention that allows them to be facilitated. And so, sheepishly I call this agency ex machina. And I'm a pragmatist by orientation, and I think, save for the gender language here, the gendered language, I think this is really what we're talking about. And John Dewey in Common Sense and Scientific Inquiry wrote, inventions of new agencies, interesting, and instruments create new ends, they create new consequences which stir men and women to form new purposes. So I think one of the central features of neuroethics is that it's an ethics about technology. A lot of our problems are caused by things that we're now aware of because of technology. I think if you look at the Obergefell decision that Justice Kennedy wrote, we learned things that made us rethink what we always thought we knew to be true. And I think that neurotechnology, neuroimaging especially, has given us a sense that things that, we're not in Kansas anymore. And of course, then the technology might help to resolve problems by helping to address the discordance between what we think is there and what might be achieved. So I think the interplay with technology is at the center of all this. So what I want to do is divide this in 3 parts. And you can decide, well, all comedies and all tragedies are divided into 3 parts. You can decide at the end of the talk whether this has been a tragedy or a comedy. So I really want to just sort of talk in sort of 3 phases. One is neuroimaging and disorders of consciousness. And Sarah began to explain what disorders of consciousness are, and I'll go through that so we're all on the same page, and talk about how neuroimaging has really kind of reshaped our landscape and the nosology and typology and how do we categorize neurologic conditions. I think one of the important things, whether it's in neurology or in psychiatry, and the whole debate about DSM, is how nosologies really create an imprint. It's sort of the grammar of our language, and it's evolving. You'll see how as we learn more about certain brain states, we realize the categories we have are just inaccurate and incomplete, and they're descriptive and they're not circuit-based, for example. And then we'll talk a little bit about how neuroimaging has given us the opportunity to interface with the injured brain and help the self re-emerge, or people who seem to be unconscious become conscious. Then I'll turn to the work that we did with deep brain stimulation in the minimally conscious state and share some of that story, the narratives. And then at the end, I'll talk about why this matters and get into some civil rights and disability rights language about what does it mean to ignore people who have agency and with the self and who are marginalized. And I just want to say here at the bottom that this is all sort of from the book, but the methods are. I want to just talk for a second about that. We have a program at Cornell and at Rockefeller University called CASB, which is the Consortium for the Advanced Study of Brain Injury. And we bring patients and families in for studies, EEG, fMRI, PET scan, neurologic exams to understand mechanisms of recovery and people who have these disorders of consciousness. And in tandem with that, I've done longitudinal interviews with these families that have come in. I've done over 53 families now. They're under IRB protocol. We have permission to use names, and I have HIPAA waivers. So when I mention names, it's with permission. And I just wanted to share that. And the reason I mention names, which is kind of it's a whole other conversation. We're talking about agency and self and personhood and why you matter. Let's give these people a name. Let's not take away their names. It's nothing about them without them. So let's have them in the room. Okay. So just since we're a one-room schoolhouse here, I want to just kind of go through with homage to Vesalius here, because after all I'm doing right now is contemplating what that skull is doing, and eventually all this will be ethereal anyway. We'll all be just like the skull here. But we're talking about brain states. And disorders of consciousness are everything from brain death to the minimally conscious state emerge. And brain death is whole brain death. I don't know if you can, it's like the brainstem here, I should say here, and higher cortical function from 1968, the Harvard criteria. Coma is an eyes closed state of unresponsiveness. This is where it all starts. Okay, when your eyes open, you're now in the vegetative state, that iconic state, Jeanette and Plum, 1972. And it's a recovery, the isolated recovery of the brainstem without higher cortical function. And then depending on how long it lasts, persistent or permanent, we'll get back to that in a second. And then there's this other new brain state in green called the minimally conscious state, which was first described and codified in 2002, and we'll describe it. So that's just sort of what we're going to go through now, just so you have a sense of where we're headed. Now, if you'd like a review article that we wrote, this was in Nature Reviews Neuroscience in January 2014 on the state of the science, and Joe Giacino was the first author. Okay, so again, the vegetative state, syndrome without a name, Brian Jeanette also for the Glasgow Coma and outcome scales, and Fred Plump also the locked-in syndrome. These are just two giants in neurosurgery and neurology, a Scottish neurosurgeon, an American neurologist. Fred was my teacher and my mentor. And this brain state had an iconic import in bioethics. It was the basis for the right to die, and everybody who was taking a bioethics 101 and maybe a 102 course, it's central to the Karen and Quinlan case, And the right to die really evolved, this negative right to be left alone, in the state of utter futility. And it's interesting, you know, it was, the utter futility was 1960, it was brain death, right? Because Henry K. Beecher wanted to use that for utilitarian purposes to retrieve organs. And interesting, the year before, 1967, he wrote an article for the hopelessly comatose, who were not brain dead, for organ retrieval. But that was going too far, so in 68, they had the Harvard criteria. And so, you know, then we had the vegetative state in 72. And in the Karen Ann Quinlan case, a young woman probably had a drug overdose. Her family petitioned the court to withdraw her ventilator, and Judge Hughes, in his decision, drawing upon the superior picture of Fred in 76, you know, said that by Dr. Plum that the brain operates in essentially two ways, the vegetative and the sapient. And we have no hesitancy to decide there's no external compelling interest of the state that should compel Karen to endure the unendurable. Interesting language there. If she's truly vegetative, how is she enduring anything? It's kind of, if you read the decision, it's kind of this cancer, death kind of language. You know, only to vegetate a few more measurable months with no realistic possibility of return to any semblance of cognitive or sapient life. So we see here the lack of agency, the lack of emergent personhood, the lack of potentiality prognosis became the moral warrant for the removal of Karen Ann Quinlan's ventilator. Now, Dr. Plum once told me, he said, Joe, he was shorter than me when I looked up and said, yes, Dr. Plum? The guy was a giant, and he was a tough guy, but, you know, brilliant. He said, I knew she would breathe when we took her off the ventilator. And I said, how'd you know, Dr. Plum? He said, I took her off the ventilator as part of my neuro exam. And of course, he had to do that, to do an apnea test to see whether or not her brainstem was intact. But he had a court order to do the neuro exam. So whether he did it or the judge ordered it, you can decide. I guess the statute of limitations are up. But anyway, this was the lack of a cognitive or sapient life. Now, what's interesting in the context of brain injury and the confluence with the right to die movement, I think this is really important, that we've kind of generalized the futility of the vegetative state to all these severe brain disorders, that nothing can or should be done. And doctors have become acculturated in the years since Quinlan to the right to die. I think now, I do clinical ethics as well, I think that it's almost too easy to have a right to die, and we jump on that bandwagon without really reflecting on what's really going on. And this notion that grew up after Quinlan, and in the Quinlan autopsy, which was the early 90s, right, that these brains are gelatinous gels. The Quinlan autopsy, which is published in the New England Journal, the brain weight was like 650 grams, half of normal. She had hydrocephalus ex vacuo. This was not a brain that could do, you know, anything. And it was without a lack of cognitive or sapient state. And the notion was these brains were static, that you were not going to improve, you're not going to change. And this held in the Cruzan decision, and of course in the Shivo decision. But as we were talking about this brain state, and there are a couple of neurologists and neurosurgeons in the room, we've had a sort of what we call a neglect syndrome. If you have a parietal lobe lesion, there's part of your visual field that you don't see, but you don't know that you're not seeing it. And there was this population of patients who were nestled within the Venn diagram of the vegetative state, who were actually minimally conscious. And these were people who were like waking up 5 years after their brain injury, and they were supposedly vegetative, and they were breaking the rules. And who were these people? And it was this new brain state called the minimally conscious state, which really speaks to the fact that this is a dynamic state and it's not as static as we thought. All the catechisms that I was taught, I say that in a parochial way, have changed since I was a medical student. Okay, so this is the dynamic story that we're talking about. And I love time in medicine, and I think here you sort of see the time frames, right? So you have a loss of consciousness, and we're not talking about brain, you can have a serious brain injury without a loss of consciousness, but we're talking about injuries where there's a serious loss, there is a loss of consciousness. Move all the way to brain death, or you can go into a coma, go into the vegetative state. After it lasts for a month, we call it the persistent vegetative state. This is according to the 1994 Multi-Society Task Force report of the New England Journal of Medicine. And after 3 months after a noxic brain injury or 12 months after traumatic brain injury, it's considered permanent. Now, just if you remember one thing from this talk, when you're giving your next bioethics talk, don't ever abbreviate this as PVS, right? Because persistent could be permanent, permanent could be persistent, and that's a difference that makes a difference. Why? Because, can you see this little arrow here, is it? Yeah. If you're in the persistent vegetative state, before it becomes permanent, you can migrate surreptitiously into the minimally conscious state. And that's what happens. Patients get discharged from the hospital. Aaron saw them, Dr. Coe saw them, got brilliant care at, what do you call this, UW? Like W? Like George W?
No.
Okay. You're a blue state, right? So I don't want to say, so you leave here, you indeed are vegetative. You're in the vegetative state, but it has yet to become permanent. And you go to the nursing home because you can't get rehab, because you can't participate, and then you move into the minimally conscious state and nobody notices. The most recent study that Carolyn Snackers and others, including Joe Giacino, did, 41%, okay, of people who were diagnosed as vegetative after traumatic brain injury in chronic care facilities are actually minimally conscious. Okay, that's right, that's what I do, that's right, I don't know your name, but yeah, it's a staggering number. And that, if we're talking about personal identity in the self, that's like the willful disregard of a lot of people. Okay, what their levels of awareness and all, you'll see, it's a scary number. And sometimes we only know after they start emerging. And emergence is when they start talking reliably. So what is the minimally conscious state? It's a definition and consensus discussion from Neurology 2002. These are people who are, in contrast to the vegetative state, they are conscious, okay, not permanently unconscious. They have intention, attention, memory. They'll grasp for a cup. They'll say their name. They'll track you when you walk into the room, but they don't do it regularly and reliably. So if I think Sarah is doing this and she's doing this behavior, and then I ask Dr. Klein to come in and I say, Sarah, can say her name, and she might have said it, and I say, Sarah, say your name. She's not going to say it. That's the biology of the condition. It's like a flickering light bulb. The fact that it flickered means it can go on, that circuit can be completed, but there's no way of knowing when it's going to flick on or off, because there's a problem of arousal from the brainstem up into the thalamus, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So when Dr. Klein, or Dr. Klein's evil clone, okay, since it's bioethics, comes in and he knows nothing about this, he'll just think that my attestation about Sarah having said her name is just willful, is hopefulness, and then I'm in denial, and Joe doesn't get it. He's a good guy, he just cares about Sarah, he just doesn't get it. And you're going to blow me off and say, it's not true. But in fact, it is true, and that's why one of the reasons is that it's a 41% error rate. The other reason is when you leave the hospital with diabetes, you don't lose diabetes. And these are not diagnoses, these are states, and states change. So this is the minimally conscious state in 2002. And the sort of the poster child for the minimally conscious state is this man I want to introduce you to, Terry Wallace. Again, I have permission to use his name and his story. He was in a car accident in 1984 in Arkansas. And then in 2003, a year after these criteria had come out, he has a miracle awakening. The media describes it as waking from a coma, from a persistent vegetative state. All the phrases that I've just tried to disaggregate, they conflated. And he had been in custodial care. His first words were mom. His second word was Pepsi. I'm a Coke drinker. I'll take it. It's okay. And over the weeks, he got greater fluency. He was Rick Van Winkle. He was still locked in 1984. Ronald Reagan was still president. At one point, later on, he and his mom or dad are watching TV, and they see, President George W. Bush on TV. And he says, who's that? He goes, well, that's President Bush. And his response was, what happened to President Reagan? Okay. Now, what's interesting is during this whole period of time, his family thought they saw him tracking. When people walked into the room, they were told that he wanted to see a neurologist. They were told it wouldn't make a difference. It wasn't going to be paid for and the like. And so it wasn't until he started talking reliably that, in retrospect, we had this inference that he'd been in a minimally conscious state. And it's remarkable because he was still not getting basic rehabilitation. He had horrible contractures because nobody would care. Who cares whether he can, have mobility, because the guy is, he's vegetative. That's the category he was in. So I was trying to get him service from his his congressman through Health and Human Services. So I was calling up Angela, his mom. I said, Angela, what's Terry's Social Security number? And this is, maybe I'm overstepping, but it's kind of like ancillary care obligations, like Richardson's argument, which we can talk about later. And she said, hold on. She says, Terry, and she knows I use an Arkansan accent from New York. She says, Terry, what's your Social Security number? And I hear this voice from the background. And she tells me, and I said, Miss Wallace, I just have to ask you a question. Was that Terry who told you the Social Security number? And she said, yeah. First time he told us, we thought he was wrong. We looked it up. He was right. Now, your Social Security number is how we, the government, identify you. That's your identity. That's your social identity. And he knew his Social Security number. Okay, take that for what it is. But the thing that I really want to just capture here, and that's kind of a happy, sort of a funny comment, maybe. I don't know, maybe we're doing comedy versus tragedy, you guys decide. This is a sad part. Because before there was a brain state that could accommodate Terry Wallace, he was already minimally conscious, but nobody knew it. That he had a personal identity. So this is a story. One day in the early 90s, okay, 10 years before the minimally conscious state is criteria, Mrs. Wallace gets a call from the nurses at the nursing home, and she says, they say, Terry's not right. So she drives to the nursing home. What had happened was, the night before, the man who he had been bunking with in his nursing home, an old man who had Alzheimer's disease, had asphyxiated himself in the sheets and died. And this is what she told me. One of the aides called me from work one morning and told me she was not supposed to do that. That man had passed away that night and that it had bothered Terry. I needed to be down there. When she arrived, Terry was lying there with his eyes open wide. He would not go to sleep. I mean, he was making no noise at the time. But I say, this is Mrs. Wallace speaking. But I stayed there with him most all the day until he finally went to sleep. So I don't know what he saw, but I know he saw something. And I know it had, and he says now, after in retrospect with the diagnosis, I knew then it had to be something that was really bad. So the point is, in retrospect, we knew that there was this ability to process what's going on, whether he understood it completely or he perceived that man had died or he was in distress or there was a commotion in the room, he was upset. And his normal pattern of going to sleep and being reassured by his mother was not there. And of course, vegetative people shouldn't be, concerned. They just sort of are. But here's an example, and I think this gives us kind of humility. We need to know that we don't know a lot about these brain states because this person was thought to be vegetative, except the nurses were kind of a fifth column. They hadn't read the textbook. And they had a kind of a moral intuition there was something wrong. They responded to that. They reached out to Mrs. Wallace, and this is her report. In retrospect, we know that he had been minimally conscious. I reviewed his medical records, and there was evidence in the medical record from 4 months after his brain injury that he had behaviors that suggested that today we would call minimal conscious. And we have biological evidence that his brain has also changed. This is work that Henning Voss and Nico Schiff and my colleagues at Cornell did. This was a cover of JCI. And this shows, this is a diffusion tensor imaging MRI. And these are, this is the kind of image that can track the directionality of fibers in the brain. And the red fibers are the ones I want you to focus on. And if you look in panel G, this is the corpus callosum. This is the white matter structures that go left to right in the brain. And you see, like in the middle there, there's really very little in the corpus callosum. See how much injury he's had. But what you do see is this glob of stuff in his parietal occipital lobe in the back, which shouldn't be there. Okay, it's conveniently circled in the top. And then 18 months later, it's not there. And then you see a quiescence here in the cerebellum of a new left to right fiber tracts. What is this? This is axonal sprouting in the brain that between remaining new connections between remaining neurons. And what to me is fascinating about this is that this is the exact same process of sprouting and pruning that we see in the developing brain. This is how we hook up babies' brains. This is the last part of your brain that gets hooked up is your frontal cortex. That's why the age majority is 18 or 21. That's when that happens. That's when you get your executive function. You sprout and you prune. And what's interesting here is biology is parsimonious. As Jacob Monod said, if that's true, the brain here is using a developmental process in the service of repair. And we've never seen this before because until about 15 or 25 years ago, we were not managing intracranial pressure the way we are now. People who were this badly injured would herniate and die. And now we put in shunts, we do craniectomies, and people like this survive. So after some kind of period of latency, the brain is now rewiring itself, and this may be somehow related, we don't know, to activation of latent stem cells that then initiate a developmental process in the service of repair. Just written a piece about this for the Yale Law Review with a law student, Megan Wright, about if brains recover through a developmental process, maybe we should think about rehabilitation more like education. And there are all kinds of implications there, but that's another discussion for another day. So this notion that brain injury is static is wrong. That is an indication of it. And this is not something that is only a modern realization. This is a debate that goes back between the Greeks and the Romans. And this is the cathedral ceiling at the Montreal Neurologic Institute at the M&I in Montreal, of course, designed by Wilder Penfield, who was the great neurosurgeon. I see Dr. Coates smiling. Wilder Penfield, he's a giant, right, in neurosurgery. An epileptologist, he was the guy who's responsible for the homunculus, and he designed this. These are Golgi cells, and in the middle here is an early representation of the brain in hieroglyphics, and around it, in the periphery, in Greek, is a Galenic refutation of the Hippocratic aphorism that all brain injury is a really bad thing. And Galen, the Roman physician, refutes Hippocrates by saying, "But I have seen the injured brain healed." So have I. So have you. Here's another example of this emergent self. Richard Blake wrote this in the book, the day Donnie Herbert wrote the book up. Don Herbert, who was not in our studies, but I did get to review this book, was a fireman in Buffalo. He got hit on the head, in a house fire, and he was out. And it was December 1995, and very briefly had some rare speech, and then he went down for 9 years. And you think that we talked before about anoxic versus traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury's got a better prognosis than anoxic brain injury. And this initially was classified as anoxic brain injury because he's in a fire. But if you look at the history, he had 100% oxygen mask as a fireman right next to his face. So he was breathing 100% oxygen. So it was more traumatic versus anoxic. Anyway, 9 years he's down. He's in a nursing home. His wife is trying to get him care. Nobody seems to care about him. And there's a new Ernest physiatrist who gives him Prozac and some SSRIs. We're not even sure what he got. And he starts talking 9 years later. So again, some nurses, right? This fifth column. Anybody a nurse in the room here? But you got to love the nurses because they don't. We're talking about hierarchies and dynamics, and they're able to question. So they call up Mrs. Blake and they say, "You got to come here because Donnie's talking." 9 years he hasn't talked, and now he's talking. So Mrs. Herbert calls up her son Nicky, who was 4 years old when his dad was injured, and they had 4 kids, and Nicky was the little boy, and they had a very special relationship. Imagine the little boy, Nicky, getting the call. You call your dad's room. You got to talk to him. Well, what do you mean? My dad doesn't talk. My dad's that guy in the nursing home, just lies there, doesn't do anything. Call your dad. It's a very thin thread. Let's not lose him. He's on this thin thread. So this is what happens. So he calls, and Herbert is incredulous that the teenage voice is his little buddy Nicky. He says, "This isn't Nicholas. He's a baby. He can't talk. He too is locked in time." So this issue of can you be who you are if you don't know how old you are? It's kind of a Heideggerian question. And Nick responds to his dad, "I can talk. Do you know how old I am?" He tells him, "I'm 13. Don responds as a fireman with vernacular, "Holy," right? And this encapsulates the whole relationship. And the conversation concludes with Don telling his son he loves him. Later, Mom, Linda, asks Nicky how his father sounded. And Nicky, and this is for me as a father, it just kind of gets me, because Nicky reminds her, "I don't know. I can't remember ever hearing him speak before." So he's back in the room. What's interesting is for 16 hours, Don Herbert, he's blind because he did have some hypoxic injury to his visual cortex, so he can't see. But all the firemen come and visit him. He knows exactly who everybody is. He recognizes their voices. He knows who he is, and he knows he's a father, and he knows he's been gone a long time, and he feels guilty. He feels as if he had abandoned his family for 9 years. I've not been my family for 9 years. So where was that self all that time? So let's talk a little bit about this in the context of neuroimaging, and distinguish the vegetative state from the minimally conscious state, because I think there's substrates that can hold agency or at least consciousness, and there are other substrates that can't, and we don't want to conflate the two. So this top left-hand panel is a study that Stephen Lurie's did. He's a very important colleague and neurologist from Liège, and he induced pain in normal controls and PBS patients, nail bed compression. And I'm sure the ethics of that we could discuss. But what's interesting is the people who were normal, whatever normal means, okay, the controls, light up the entire pain network. They have a network response, all in red. Okay, the people who were in the minimally the vegetative state, sorry. Again, it's labeled as PBS, which is it just should be vegetative, permanent vegetative state. Only light up the primary sensory area. So the first relay into the brain, but not the pain network. So one of the key points between the difference between the vegetative patient, the truly vegetative patient, and the minimally conscious patient is the presence or absence of a network response. You need to have a network response. And this bottom panel is a study that was done at Cornell with Nico Schiff, Joy Hirsch, and my colleagues. And what they did, and this is in 2005, they took minimally conscious patients and normal controls, although they use grad students as controls, so whether or not people criticize it, yeah. They took the minimally conscious patients and normal controls, and they played forward and backwards tapes of narratives, okay? So Aaron, remember when we were kids and Mom took us to the beach and played forward and you played backwards, so it's the same frequency spectrum. They only lit up the language networks when it was played forward, but not backwards. And so that suggests processing of language, and we'll talk more about language. So so I was not an author of this study, but I was interviewed by Ben Carey, and I said this, and this was on the front page of the Times, and I said, right in the middle of the Shivo debate, and I said, this study gave me goosebumps because it shows this possibility of this profound isolation. These people are there, they've been there all along, even though we've been treating them as if they're not. And it raises the question, the importance of language. They're processing not sound, but processing language. And this gets even more interesting because that was a passive paradigm, okay, with language. And then you have the Adrian Owen study in Cambridge in 2006, where he asked patients to actually take a command to do something with the command and demonstrate actively they were able to process it. This was a woman, this is a 25-year-old woman who had a car accident, pretty good looking brain, but was vegetative clinically. And they asked her to imagine herself playing tennis, walking through her house, and disaggregating linguistically similar words. And she lit up for tennis her motor area, her parietal for spatial orientation, and the linguistic area. No different than control. And they called this paper, Detecting Awareness of the Vegetative State, which I think was a bit disingenuous, because if you're having awareness and responsive, you can't be in the vegetative state because the vegetative is wakeful unresponsiveness, but it does create the need for a new category which we created in a Hastings Center piece. We called it non-behavioral MCS. And this gets to the beginning of this kind of discordance between what you see in the imaging versus what you see behaviorally. And we've been using behavioral criteria, the multi-society task force criteria, all behavioral. In fact, we don't have imaging criteria yet. All we have are behavioral criteria. But it's sort of the difference between, genotype and phenotype. If we only look at phenotype, we realize that, Mendel's garden, that all the peas should be white, but we know that there's heterogeneity there. So this is a notion here where on neuroimaging there might be the possibility that patients look different, as it were, under the hood. I hate to use that metaphor, than they do over. Okay. And then this paper was a paper that Martin Monti did using that same paradigm. And they actually established a communication channel with the patient toggling tennis imagery for yes and spatial navigation imagery for no. Now, interestingly, this patient was unrecruitable using behavioral criteria initially. After they did this, they went back and they studied him even more, and they actually were able to elicit behavioral criteria. But what's interesting is, and it's not foolproof, is that patients who could follow behavioral commands couldn't always do the task on neuroimaging. So we don't, and nobody understands, and this is 10 years now, nobody understands, or 7 years now, 6 years now, nobody understands that. And it remains, the best test is not neuroimaging, but the coma recovery scale revised that Joe Giussino developed. But for this patient, there was a kind of a deontological value for this one individual, but the clinical exam has got greater utilitarian value. Now I want to tell you about a study we did that involves Maggie Worthen, who's the main character in the book, and her mother Nancy, because we did a very similar study with her, and Maggie was a senior at Smith College when she had a brainstem stroke that actually went up into her thalamus, and this is actually her DTI image here of her brain, which flipped for just cosmetic purposes. But you see here this big gap in her brainstem, and this sort of empty space up where her thalamus would be. And she came to us in the context of being thought to be vegetative, and we found out that she was indeed minimally conscious. And this is another context about neuroprosthetics. Nancy said, I want to be as aggressive as I can to help her communicate, but how can I? So I have to convince people that she could communicate. And if I can only convince people that she'd be able to do this, then we could just find a pathway, so let's try it. And what we did is she had been a swimmer. So instead of having her play tennis, we had her swim. Had her, imagine herself swimming, and she was able to do this. This was published in Brain back in 2011. What's interesting is that she had activations outside of the expected region of interest, and there was also activations outside of the temporal constraints that we would have expected, so there was a delay. So initially we thought there wasn't a response. The response was buried in the next question. So this is very tricky stuff. And it really becomes an amazing thing to see people who have been categorically sort of misdiagnosed and misunderstood to begin to re-emerge. And this was a long journey for her. And this is a videotape of her using, she has one eye that she can use. Okay. Like, let there be light. That she can use to communicate. She's kind of like Jean-Claude Bobby in the Diving Bell and Butterfly, except she has cognitive impairment that he obviously didn't have. So she comes to us. People thought she was vegetative. Doug Katz in Boston thought maybe she wasn't. We did our studies, we did our evaluation. But here's the sort of the culmination of this, where she's actually able to use a neuroprosthetic, a kind of eye gaze thing to actually communicate. And I hope this works, because now she's able to follow her names.
Exactly. Awesome. Seconds. Do one more.
And you see here the image of her mother in the screen. And this gets to, I think, Francois, this notion of relationality. This connection between her mother and her. That was opened up by this. I'll tell you a moving moment for us. Before this happened, I had been talking to Nancy one morning. It was in February, I think, of 2008. And I was hearing the whole story about the injury and how she'd been marginalized by the healthcare system, and in a nursing home with old people and wasn't getting rehabilitation. I'm hearing this whole story, and I said, so what are your hopes, what are your expectations? She said, if she knew that I was her mother, that would make a big difference. So I went over to the hospital across the street, and Nico, my colleague, Nico Schiff, and I were doing the neuro exam. And normally, you take up a pen, you say, Maggie, this is a pen, look down for yes. And so Nico and I had not had a chance to debrief with each other. We're both standing on each side of the bed, and Nancy is over here. And he says, just out of the blue, he says, Maggie, is that woman at the end of your bed your mom? The pause, and then her eye goes down. And then Nancy comes over and just kind of grabs me, and she's a big person, and I just kind of held on for dear life. And there were tears, and I did not know until I saw her face whether they're tears of joy or tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, and it was a remarkable journey for them, and this continued. Sadly, Maggie died this last August, just days after the book came out, and we were hoping that she'd be a perfect candidate for a BCR. That was the next step for her, but it's not going to happen for her. Okay. So these examples of these late recoveries, the role of neuroimaging, as well as some pharmacologic interventions, amantadine, which can accelerate the recovery of consciousness, and zolpidem, which we'll talk about, and it raises the question of, is there any way that we can sustain and augment these recoveries and identify these people? And I want to tell you in some detail about our work using deep brain stimulation in a patient who was in the minimally conscious state. And the basic idea here is to take a person who's on this C tangent here in the minimally conscious state and be able to get them to move up into the emerged state where they have reliable functional communication. There's a great metaphor for this, and Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, who wrote To Psychocivilized Society, and he's the guy who's famous for the bull ring with the stimaceiver in Spain. And this book, everybody thinks it's about, like using deep brain stimulation or psychosurgery to control violence and everything. That's like the parody of the book. It's actually a brilliant and very smart book. It was really to understand the sources of violence. And this book you really should read. It's like not having read Freud and think it's all about sex and death. This is also that kind of book. But he uses this metaphor, which is perfect for the minimally conscious state. Because the minimally conscious state is a state of potentiality. And he says potentiality is like a beautiful highway, able to accommodate traffic and facilitate the exchange of visitors among many cities. The highway, however, cannot create cars, trucks, merchandise, businessmen, workers, and all of life which circulates along it. The road makes functions possible, but by itself is a useless stretch of pavement. And this gets back to that notion of network response. That the minimally conscious brain has a network that is intact but underactivated, whereas the vegetative brain, permanent vegetative brain, has a network that is not intact and cannot be activated. So the idea is, how do you populate the highways with cars, traffic, and commerce? And that's what the DBS did. And what we did, it was published in Nature in 2007. And how much more time do I have? Okay, so I'm going to kind of quickly go over the ethics of this study, how we designed this study, because I have 10 years worth of work. But let me just simply say that there were three parts of this. One was to overcome historical distortions and false analogies of deep brain stimulation with psychosurgery, which was ablative and destructive and unregulated, versus neuromodulation, which already had a long track record and was an established therapy for Parkinson's disease. Also rediscovering the psychosurgery report in 1977, which was written by the National Commission, who also wrote the Belmont report, that did not prohibit psychosurgery, but thought it should be allowed to go forward in a certain regulated way. The second point was to overcome the perception of nihilism about these brain states that come back to the history of the vegetative state, realize, say, this is a different brain state and there's potentiality here. And then finally, to really talk about the issue of consent. This took 10 years to get through, but I think in bioethics, because of seeing the regulatory space in a regulatory way, unless in an ethical way, we tend to conflate informed consent with respect for personhood. If you can't get informed consent, we're disrespecting personhood. But I think that there's a difference between doing something to somebody without their consent or over their objection, than saying this population can't give consent, and what do we do about it? Because I think that the reason they can't give consent is the object of the intervention, because the goal here is to restore functional communication so they can consent or participate in decision making. So when we designed the study, we used a legally authorized representative and staged consent, but we also put a proviso into the study that my colleagues thought was kind of like, really? Really think it's going to happen? I said, yes, we have to put this in for ethical symmetry, that if a patient ever got to the point where they could provide their own consent, we'd have to reconsent them, or at least determine whether they had capacity. It seems obvious in retrospect, but prospectively it seemed like Joe was being delusional again. So what we did was we designed the study, and the other thing was proportionality. So we had to find a brain state that had the hypothetical possibility of being activated in this way without doing incremental harm to the patient. So we initially they wanted to do a higher functioning set of patients, and I said we have to go as low as we can go where there was a theoretical possibility it would work. So we needed an intact network, so it was a minimally conscious state. We went below that, and eventually we said we got a network to activate. But if we went to a higher level of function, we could actually cause incremental harm, which we wouldn't want to do for a phase 1 study. The other thing is time. We wanted to, if people take a year to get to the minimally conscious state before the vegetative state is permanent, we wanted to say, let's wait at least a year before the study is done. Throughout this process, and I think this is important when you're doing BCI research, whatever, we had complete transparency. When we first presented this to neuroscience, with posters, we had the ethics poster and the science poster right next to each other in the same space, and we were all in each other's papers, and we did this from the get-go. And we went through multiple IRBs. We had FDA, IDE, we engaged the public. I think given the legacy of psychosurgery and all the mishaps, you want to be transparent about it. So we had our inclusion criteria greater than a year. They had to have enough material in the language system and have a stable coma recovery scale baseline. And the outcomes were the subcategories of the coma recovery scale. And we had a double-blind crossover study, so 6 months double-blind crossover study. And these are the electrodes going into the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus bilaterally. And this is a CAT scan. So it looks like we're driving a truck through this person's brain, but it just scattered off the metal electrodes. These are microfilaments, but it looked far worse. Dr. Klein, please agree with me. It doesn't look as bad as it looks. So the patient had a closed head trauma 6 years prior to the study. His initial Glasgow coma scale was 3, which is as low as one can go before you die. He had transitioned to the minimally conscious state about 2 or 3 months after his injury, and he had a stable baseline. All he could do was sometimes move his eye intermittently. That was the extent of his interaction before the intervention. With the intervention, and this is published in Nature, he had increased cognitively mediated behaviors and language. He could say 6 or 7 word sentences. He could tell his mother he loved her. He could go shopping with her. And he had improved limb control, and he could eat for the first time in 6 years. He had been on peg feed. And when the simulator was turned off, he would lose his ability to maintain his secretions, and he would just kind of droop down. Now there was carryover effect from month to month, so there was some induction of some kind of maybe plasticity. So month on, month off, he was better in the off months than he was in the preceding month off. But this was the first evidence that DBS can promote late recovery from severe TBI, and it is the first step in a long journey. Now, for me, the highlight of the whole thing was we were after the study was done, and we're doing post study stimulation parameters. There are two pad pacemakers in the chest, just a pack. It's the Medtronic usual pacemaker, and we're doing stimulation parameters. Each electrode has 4 contacts, and you can do charge and frequency, and it takes forever. Every time you change one thing, you got to go back and check everything else. And it's a long, laborious process with a hot summer day. And one of the physical therapists said to Greg, and his name is Greg Pearson, and I have his permission, had his mother's permission to use his name, said, "Greg, do you want to continue?" And he said no. And we stopped. And I looked at my watch, and it was 2:50 in the afternoon. And it was like, I said, guys, this is like we restored this guy's ability to participate in decisions. Not at the level of consent and refusal, but certainly assent and dissent. And for me, that was the restoration of some element of voice and agency. And there's several chapters about this in the book, so I'm giving you the précis here. But his nickname had been Freedom. And his mother said, this is a quote, "So inside, it's still freedom." These are a mother's inferences, okay? It's not dispositive, but this is what we have. And if the sort of stuff that Francois is going to talk about is important, and I think it's very important, this notion of relationality, what the person who's closest to this patient has to say about who this person is and has again become, I think is important. Relationships re-emerge. His old preferences, he was a sharp dresser. He liked certain clothes, he liked certain TV programs, he liked Batman. And she said, freedom remains, and she said he's the same kid. And there's this symbolic, marker of continuity of this former self re-emerging through a neuroprosthetic device, which is quite remarkable. If not philosophical proof, it's provocative. And she talks about they went to Old Navy to go shopping. I think these narratives are important. If I take him and buy things and bring them and ask him if he likes it, he can let me know what he likes and what he don't like, she said. And if he doesn't like it, I'll take it back. So she's respecting his preferences. And she said she would do this with great joy. Her son is back in the room. He couldn't do that before. And there's a new degree of reciprocity and relationality, which before had been a very, a paternalistic or unilateral relationship. Now, I think this was a good thing, although I always worried about whether or not we had done him harm. Now that he's more aware of his disabilities or inabilities or his pain or suffering or the burden of his condition, have we actually created a kind of Frankenstein? Is this a bad thing? I thought it was a good thing. But there have been critics. Grant Gillette wrote a piece, which I commend to you just because it's provocative. And he said, minimally conscious state deep brain stimulation, and what is worse than futility? And he had an acronym, without apologies to Shakespeare, he had RUB. There's the RUB. RUB, risk of unacceptable badness. That was his acronym. And he criticized, okay, sorry, Grant, but it's really problematic, and making judgments from afar is really problematic. But I think we actually have this risk of, when we think about what it means to be in these brain states, we don't want to romanticize these brain states. None of us want to be there. But you can't actually control where you end up. The question is, do you meet people where they are? And here's a story of an exchange with Corinne shared with me, because she said, Greg seems to be depressed. And she told me this story. And I'm thinking, oh my God, maybe people like Grant Gillette are right. We actually have done something more bad than good. And she tells the story. She said, he was crying one day. I was visiting him, and I said, Greg, why are you crying? He says, I'm crying for Corey. And I didn't know who Corey was, so I said, who's Corey? And I had spent hours and hours with this family. And she says, that's his brother. That's his brother that does not come to see him. That's in denial. And she said, even I started crying, because here he is, he's aware, he knows what's going on. His sadness was not about his own situation. His sadness was that he missed his brother. And then there was a second degree of awareness, was that she thinks that Greg was sad because he knew his brother couldn't bear to see him that way. So that is a kind of a restoration of, he's back in the room. He's a person back in the room. And we don't want to project who we think that person is. Let's hear from him, who's in the room. Now, I'm going to start winding this up a little bit here, and just say from a scientific point of view, this work is also important because we're now getting a sense of the circuitry of consciousness, and this is the mesocircuit hypothesis that Nico Schiff and Jerry Posner, as in Clement Posner, developed. And basically, it's the centrality of the thalamus and thalamic output to the frontal cortex, and this can be driven directly through deep brain stimulation here, which directly drives the system. And the thalamus also looks down into the brainstem. So you need both arousal and integration. And you can be awake but not conscious, right? Which is the vegetative state. So you just have brainstem, but without the integration, you're not conscious. But you can't be conscious unless you have a baseline level of arousal from the brainstem. And you can also drive the thalamus by removing an inhibition here, using a drug like zolpidem or higher up dopamine. And here's an example of a patient who got zolpidem or Ambien, the sleeping pill, this is metabolic levels. You see how the frontal cortex with placebo and zolpidem turns on. And that's the activation of this mesocircuit. Okay, why does this matter? Why should we care? Well, I think, historically and sociologically now, the stories that we hear from these families and others is that these people are segregated, and I use that word deliberately, in chronic care. They're misdiagnosed at this staggering rate. There's this ongoing perception that brain injuries are static, there's nihilism. And I think this gets to something maybe Francois will be talking about. These folks are denied voice. And when we deny them their voice, we deny them communication, and there's a relationship between communication and community. The only consciousness that I know, honestly, is my own, and the only way that you know that you think I'm there is by my communicating with you. So communication becomes a way to reintegrate you back into civil society. And if we deny people proper diagnosis and treatment, we can't bring them back into society. This is a paper that was in Physical Medicine Rehabilitation, just talking about the horrific state of care. And there are a couple of social structures that get in the way. The first, medical necessity, and the notion that unless you're demonstrating improvement, we're not going to pay for it. This notion of the improvement standard. And the problem is we do not know in the minimally conscious state how long is too long. Remember that curve? That tangent goes on forever. Most things in medicine, the longer you're sick, the worse it's going to be. It's not true in MCS. As long as that network is intact, it has the potentiality to be activated. We can always drive a car on that highway. So whether it's Terry Wallace or Don Herbert or Maggie, we don't really know. And if you have insurance criteria that says we're not going to pay for it unless you get better by a stipulated period of time. And the same thing is true for DBS trials for depression, by the way. The reclaim study was too short, for example, and I wonder if others will talk about it. But the bottom line here is the soundbite is brains recovered by biological standards, not reimbursement criteria. And all of our discussions, all of our theoretical discussions about agency and all this stuff mean nothing if we don't pay for the care these people deserve. Let's get back to does it matter? Well, when people get adequate care, this is a paper from the NIDER TBI model systems that recent Nakasi Richardson did down at Tampa VA. 21% of people who come in with a Glasgow Coma scale of 3 regain functional independence. That's a number that's better than most cancer trials, and it's a number that probably surprised most of you who don't live in this space. Okay, so what's the goal? I think the goal is giving voice. This is Terry Wallace. You say to him, "Nice to meet you." He says, "Good to be met." He's expressing who he is through his, very stereotypic use of language. And I think that, Freud and the interpretation of dreams that he only discovered when he saw the Oedipal complex, what the poets already knew. And I think a modern day poet is Pedro Almodovar, the Spanish filmmaker who made this film about two women who were both severely brain injured. And the title in Spanish, in English, is Talk to Her, but it's an egregious mistranslation, because in Spanish it is Tim.
Hable con ella.
Con ella, right. Hable con ella, right. Good job. Thank you. And it's con is the key thing here, and con is with. And it's this notion of relationality. And we restore community by restoring communication and putting us with these people. And interestingly, in this film, there's a guy who's an orderly who sexually assaults one of the patients that Almodovar, interestingly, names Benino, the good one. So what is that about? You can read the book, but I'm not going to go there. I don't think what he did was appropriate, but there's that sort of paradox that he was a person who did engage with her, albeit in a horrible way. But it's hable con ella, talk with her, and this notion of reintegrating back into society. Now, when I was writing the book, and I was writing all about the neglect of this population, I was asking myself, where is the American Disability Act? You would think this was egregious, a violation of the ADA. And the ADA requires maximal integration of people back into civil society. And I was struggling. I said, it's a civil rights issue, because these people are treated as if they're not citizens. or is it a disability rights issue? I was kind of muddled about it. So I went and I saw her Heifeld book. I don't know if any of you do disability studies, but she was the architect of the ADA, and she's an Obama appointee to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and professor of law at Georgetown. And she was a major writer, and when I was saying, if we can restore functional communication, get these people to talk, we can bring them back into society. And she said, you're making an Olmsted decision. And I said, okay, great, I'm really glad I'm making some kind of argument, but what is an Olmsted argument? Olmsted. And she said, that was a case in Georgia where two women mentally ill with developmental issues were institutionalized. They wanted to be deinstitutionalized. They were medically ready to be deinstitutionalized. And the state of Georgia said, we can't do that because it'll cost too much. And the Supreme Court said, no, you've got to maximally integrate these people into civil society. And so the question is, these people require the restitution of voice that's dependent upon rehabilitation, neuroprosthetics, devices, and treatment to be maximally integrated into society. The relationship to civil rights, though, is interesting, because I think historically this population, because of the history of the right to die, even the language of the vegetative state, they have not been perceived as citizens that are worthy of the protection of the law. But this is an old story, from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. The disenfranchised first had to get the rights of citizenship before they got the protection of the law. So you had a right to vote unless you were a woman. You had a right to education unless you were a little black kid in the South. And you had a right to get married unless you were gay until Obergefell. So this is a dispossessed group. Now when I talk to college kids, there may be some college kids here, they look at me with a sense of like my generation is like about gay marriage. And how could you guys have gotten that wrong for so long? How could people who loved each other couldn't get married? That doesn't seem right. And I said, you're right. But we figured that out. We got it, okay? I said, your kids are going to look at you and say, how did you treat conscious individuals like that? And let them linger in nursing homes. I think this could be the next civil rights issue of our generation. And it's no different than these other dispossessed and disenfranchised groups. And I think that this notion of integrating people maximally into society is not just a U.S. ADA construct, it's also a Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN, and I think it also gets us back to technology. And the issue is, it's not just about rights, it's about capabilities. And what Martha Nussbaum talks about, capabilities approach, Amartya Sen, the health economist at Harvard, economist at Harvard won the Nobel Prize, and Sridhar Venkatapuram have all written about capabilities. And I think that the neurotechnology here, the neuroprosthetics, the devices, the treatment, these are the capabilities that allow for the realization of these important rights. Now, let's say we do all that, we are going to have the challenge of what do we do with these rights? How do we integrate the re-emergent self into the dialogue with partial voice? And I'm not going to get into that now for the interest of time, but we can talk about that. And let me just close by just closing with this theme about neuroethics and the ethics of technology. As I said at the beginning, this is the epilogue from Judy Ellis's book, Barbara Sahakim's book, on the Handbook of Neuroethics, is that neuroethics really is an ethics of technology. Technology exposes problems, and it will also help to resolve problems. But none of that's going to make sense unless we bring the values issues back into the equation. That's why I'm really delighted that this program in values is talking about this. And I just want to close with one final slide, and just the punchline, right? In Spain, they have the Federation of Acquired Brain Injury, the Spanish Federation of Acquired Brain Injury. And their motto is, una vida salvada merece ser vivida. A life that is saved deserves to be lived. And I think we have to respect these people who we may not always see as there, who are there, and give them the opportunity to live as full a life as possible. Not only the beneficiaries of acute care, but of an enduring regard for their well-being, their agency, themselves. I want to thank my colleagues, my families, the families that help participate in this, and our funders, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Now we have Dr. Aaron Klein to give a few comments, and then we'll open it up for discussion from the audience.
today and to follow Dr. Finns, who I have a great admiration for, as he knows, not only for work in this area, which I've been following for a long time, but also just in terms of his ardent support for the humanities, philosophy in particular, in medical education and bioethics. I want to talk a little bit about expectations, which is sort of a thread that runs throughout the talk that we just heard. Boy, there's so much to sort of dig our teeth into here, and so I'm going to try to be brief here, and allow us to do that both after I'm done and then at the end of the day. But before I kind of get there, I do want to just kind of give a sense from the clinical world of just how transformative this and disruptive this work has been. So I'm a practicing neurologist, and one of my tasks is from time to time to be called upon to counsel families about prognosis after brain injury. And so this is an area that from the clinical side has seemed fixed for years, sort of mired in what Dr. Finns referred to as sort of this nihilism. And so, kind of full disclosure, I sort of feel like I've participated in that nihilism for some time. And so, when the way those consultations usually work for me is that I get called by an ICU to come down and talk to a family and to sort of move the conversation that they've already started to have, which is sort of either talking about that things don't look good, or merely just sort of hinting about that. And so they call in me as the neurologist to come down and sort of shift that conversation to really there's no realistic hope of recovery, right? And so one of the things that I will often do is, or have done in the past, is sort of carry with me these what little data there is about recovery from brain injury. And so this is the sort of Plum and Posner book, which is sort of a classic in this area. And then this is sort of an example of a chart about prognosis that sort of I use and my mentors used, and there's sort of a canonical way of sort of using this data in the field, and to sort of come down and talk to families, sometimes actually hand them this data to show that the chance for meaningful recovery, as the term is often used, is from some of these studies almost non-existent. And what often follows from, not always, but what often follows from those discussions is the family deciding to remove life support and let their family die. And I think that it's only been in the last 10 or 15 years that after the work from Dr. Finns and sort of related groups that he talked about, that this has sort of thrown this whole practice into uncertainty, and the sense that I'm not sure that I know what we are prognosticating about, whether or not any recommendations that I'm giving, whether or not they're serving that population well. And so I was sort of searching around for an analogy here, and the best I could come up with was that it's like the researchers in this area sort of grabbed hold of the crystal ball, or the snow globe, right? He gave it a giant, violent shake, and we're all just sort of waiting for things to sort of settle out in knowing how to counsel families sort of in that immediate aftermath, within days of this traumatic injury to their loved one, what to tell them, right? What to tell them about how long, what are the chances that they will move from this state into a minimally conscious state? What are the chances that that's going to happen, if that happens at all, that's going to happen next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What are the chances that they'll get insurance coverage to cover any of this? What are the chances that this is going to devastate them economically as a family? Right? I mean, these are just huge, huge implications, and I think there's just uncertainty as to how to counsel. So I think this work has been sort of shaken the foundations of in the clinical world, and I think we're just, and so it's so valuable, but it's so hard to understand where we're going right now. All right, so I want to talk about, again, just very, very briefly about expectations, and I want to connect that to this notion of therapeutic misconception, which is something that Dr. Finns and his colleagues sort of talk about in this area. And so, just by way of review, the therapeutic misconception, and you can sort of read the quotes here from the NBAC and from Litz and Applebaum, is essentially this idea that some subjects, some volunteers in research sort of misunderstand what the purpose of the intervention, the research is. And they mistake that the research intervention as personally benefiting them, as that's the intention of the intervention, rather than as to generate scientific knowledge. And this is worrisome, of course, because you want someone when they're enrolling in research, or practices are enrolling them in research, to understand what they're getting into. Because without that, we worry about the validity of the consent. And so this typically comes up in the context of pharmacological trials, this issue equally applies to neural engineered devices. So for instance, Applebaum's group did this study with individuals who were being screened for entry into a DBS trial for psychiatry. And they found that 2/3 of the individuals they surveyed showed some element of therapeutic misconception. So obviously an issue here. And Dr. Finns and his colleagues have talked about the therapeutic misconceptions with regard to DBS in minimally conscious state. And elsewhere, although we didn't present this today, they identified sort of two sources of this, two potential sources. Right? One is what you might say is sort of the implicit biases of researchers. Right? So people who are heavily invested, both emotionally, career-wise, and otherwise, in a particular research area, obviously believe very passionately in that, and they believe that it will benefit individuals. And so there is a concern that those implicit biases might sort of seep into conversations that they have with patients. The second source of the therapeutic misconception here is just sort of media, what we might call media hype, right? That you get, the way media portrays some of this neurotechnology is as a miracle cure, right? As solving this problem that everyone wants solved. And so I sort of put up a picture here that was in the news about BCI in the last couple of days. About this gentleman who's now able to essentially play guitar, right? And the little advertisement here that just happened to coincide, I think, sort of curiously fits with the same sort of theme. But Dr. Finns, in this article in the Hastings Center, tells this sort of example of being interviewed by a reporter from a very well-respected magazine about this DBS research, and then finding that the article used language that was, how should I say it charitably, a little over enthusiastic for what the research had actually showed, in the sense that the articles seemed to say that this was a cure for the persistent vegetative disorder.
Which I never said that.
Right. And Dr. Finn said, so in the article, he talks about sort of his failed efforts to go and try to get that language more nuanced before publication, but to no avail. But but this sort of comes back to bite him in a conversation that he has with a family with a brain injury. When they pull out that article and say, yeah, but this article about your research says that this is a potential cure for PBS, right? So we want that to help guide our how you treat our family. So both sort of worrisome and maybe a little maddening. So what I want to do is just sort of put something out on the table, both for Dr. Finns and for all of us in the room, about something that I've been wondering about a potential source of therapeutic misconception in brain-computer interface research. And that is whether or not there's something about this sort of iterative, exploratory nature of this research that might create a kind of fertile ground for the therapeutic misconception. And so let me sort of give an overly simplistic comparison of pharmacologic trials and BCI trials. And there are people in the room who can actually help me a lot more, help us a lot more. But the overly simplistic comparison is that, when you do a pharmaceutical trial, you have a medication as a specific chemical formula, right? And you design a trial around that where you give that medication to different groups in different doses, or you give that medication in a particular dose and compare it to a different medication, right? And so you set the protocol and you begin the study, and then the protocol is essentially locked in for the entirety of the study. Whereas there's something about some BCI trials, probably not all, in which there's a kind of space for exploration and for sort of learning within the trial, right? That we don't really, isn't really a part of pharmaceutical trial. So it may be that when you're doing a BCI trial, you have to sort of tweak the training paradigm in order to sort of adjust to the subject, right? So maybe they get fatigued, and so maybe you change when you do certain tests or how you do them, or maybe you have to adjust the algorithm based on how the leads happen to be functioning or where they happen to get located, right? And these are sort of adjustments that sort of get made sort of within the protocol, right? And often as part of this collaboration with the subject and the research team, and we can say, so Tim Brown is one of the graduate students in our group who's doing these interviews with an individual with a BCI, and so one of the things that he's been exploring, I think, is how that collaboration sort of works over time, and so I think what strikes me about this is that in some ways it is this collaboration, and so you might say, so how does this touch on the therapeutic misconception? Well, it seems to me that ongoing relationship, that ongoing interaction, is goal directed in some way, right? It's to get better and better at making the device work, and often that device, I think, from the subject's point of view, is trying to treat tremor. It's trying to treat some psychiatric symptom. It's trying to treat something that's sort of health related. And so, over time, it's easy for me to imagine that there's a sense in which this experiment takes on this sort of therapeutic feel, right? And that's regardless of whether or not the subject starts out at the very beginning of the study with a crystal clear understanding of the difference between research and therapy, right? It just may be a function of the way this research is done, the exploratory nature of this research, that leads us to a therapeutic misconception. And so, what I wanted to sort of put on the floor was whether or not there is something unique about this sort of research, that generates maybe a different kind of therapeutic misconception, or whether or not there's ways in which we might be able to address that in different ways than we address the therapeutic misconception. Thank you.
It's the shades have come
Yeah,
down.
yeah, I guess
Give Joe a chance just to make a couple of responses to Aaron, and then we'll have questions. Oh, there's Dustin's baby.
She's asleep.
I need the help with the baby back. So just thank you, Aaron, very much for your thoughtful comments. I think the notion that new information messes things up is not a reason not to pursue new information. The recommendation, I actually wrote, there's a 4th edition of Stupor and Coma, and I wrote the ethics chapter at the end. And one way to kind of deal with this iteration of prognosis, I've suggested what's called time-delimited prognostication. And the metaphor that I use elsewhere is, the hurricane. The hurricane coming off the west coast of Africa. We don't know if it's going to hit Galveston or Charleston. And if we said that everybody on the eastern seaboard should watch out, it would be over the top. So when somebody says there's no hope for meaningful recovery on day one, many cases they don't really know that, because we're still far out from when we know when meaningful recovery will happen. So I use those temporal milestones that were in that chart to kind of make comments about, let's see how long they're in a coma. Let's see where they go out of their coma. Let's see how long they're in the vegetative state and the state of recovery. So you can kind of begin to parse it out. With respect to the 1985 Stupor and Coma, you invoke the Levy paper, the Levy criteria, which is from 1985. That criteria has been completely invalidated with the use of therapeutic hypothermia. And David Levy was one of my teachers as well, and it all came from Cornell. But right now, the scariest area in neurology is people who have a cardiac arrest, who have a noxic brain injury, who get chilled saline in the ambulance, which is neuroprotective. It comes from the diving reflex. If you're a dolphin, you can go down under the water for a long period of time. The water gets colder, protects the brain, and you could be hypoxic for a long period of time. So they give people saline at 94 degrees, and it seems to mitigate the effects of hypoxia or anoxia. What exactly the prognosis is, we don't know. So it does create this tremendous disruption. The other thing about this disruption is that it also shakes the core of the power dynamics in the ICU. The neurointensivists used to have total hegemony and said there's no hope for meaningful recovery. They can move the patient out of the bed and open up the space. They can no longer do that. With respect to the therapeutic misconception, we were very clear in our stage consent process to say this is a phase 1 study with no hope for there's no hope for direct patient benefit. We were very clear about that. We had research consent monitors, and we were always very clear about that. And that was in our protocol. We are not endorsing, the bias at all. When I wrote about, the doctors, I was trying to point out that one of the challenges of therapeutic misconception is that anybody who invests 10 years doing this work is going to feel like it works. So if we don't acknowledge the bias the investigator has, we can't kind of mitigate that with a consent monitor or something else. The bit about the New York Times about curing the vegetative state. What happened was that Carl Zimmer wrote this wonderful article in the Sunday Times magazine, and everything that should have been about the vegetative, minimally conscious state, he was writing about the vegetative state. The pullouts were wrong. So we went to see Fred, who was still alive at the time, and Fred Plum called up the New York Times editor. Okay, and Fred, just got red in the face, and he was totally angry about it. And the editor is telling Fred Plum, who invented the vegetative state, well, it really doesn't matter. Okay, and I say in the book, it's basically like telling Moses that something, that the 10 Commandments, it's not right. So Fred got really annoyed, and so they couldn't fix it because we found out about it Wednesday. The thing had already been published, printed. We did get a retraction letter in the New York Times magazine, of course, and they said, well, we can. There were 4 of us who were profiled in the study in the article. We all were signatories: Joy Hirsch, Nico, me, and Joe Giacino. And they said, well, we can only have one person writing letters. We all need to be on the letter. And I said, if you don't do that, we're going to go to the public editor. The Jason Blair thing had just happened. So we did get a retraction that there were mistakes in the Times. But again, it doesn't help because people don't see the retraction, they see the article. Finally, this last bit about, these trials are different. I totally agree. I think that, we've tried to explant, a pharmaceutical model for the regulation of devices. I think that's an area that really needs a lot of work. Devices cost more, we do fewer of them, and they have to have a bigger impact to be successful, and they're invasive, and they're there forever, unless you take them out. Not true for drugs, which can wash out, which have lower unit cost. And this issue about, therapeutic misconception and collaboration, I want to just mention again the work of Henry Richardson, who was a philosopher at Georgetown, who wrote a book called Moral Entanglements, and he writes with ancillary care obligations for investigators, mostly about work in the developing world, but I think it has direct relation to the marginalized population, that the old dichotomization between research and therapy, when you're doing one or the other, therapeutic work is kind of blurred. Sometimes it's okay to blur it based on the degree of entanglement and involvement and dependency of the person you're collaborating with. And the word collaboration is an interesting word. It comes from co-laboring together. And I do think that this notion of moving from subject to participant, these people are collaborators with us. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I think you're absolutely right to say we have to think about it and understand it so we can manage it. Because as co-laborers, there is this concern that they can think it's therapeutic, but it's still an experimental thing. But I appreciate very thoughtful comments.
Okay, so questions? Questions for either of them? And by the way, just we're on California time, so we'll just start the next one a little bit late. You'll still have time for coffee and treats. Janelle, you want to start?
I want to thank you very much. I'm Janelle Taylor. I'm an implant technologist here, and found a really exciting paper. And I guess one thing that struck me, and maybe just offering another sort of way of restating what you were already saying, which is if you assume that people won't get better and you treat them as if they won't get better, then lo and behold, you prove yourself right? There's a self-fulfilling prophecy dimension to this, and it strikes me that, maybe we should think of prognosis as a kind of a performative utterance, right? You call this thing into existence. It's not just a judgment about some reality. And I guess partly because of that, I was also struck, and because my own sort of interest is in cognitive impairment resulting from brain conditions that are not, at this point, thought to be reversible, right? So dementia, Alzheimer's, these kind of things. And I was struck by a few places in your talk where, in the context of pointing out that someone had been treated as if they could not recover, you seem to sort of accept that we must do everything we can for people who have the possibility of recovering brain function, and seem to almost imply that it's okay to not do everything possible for people who have these chronic or degenerative conditions. So I was struck by, for example, one place where you talked about Terry, how he was in a nursing home with old people and he wasn't getting rehab. And of course he should be getting rehab, but so should the old people for whatever capacities they have now and might be able to retain, or whatever kind of enrichment and value rehab and attention and care might be able to provide for people, whether or not they can get better and recover lost functions.
Great. So I don't disagree with that, but let me just do it in sequence. The notion of prognosis being important. Jim Burnett, who was a very famous neurologist and neuroethicist, when I interviewed him for the book, and he was part of the Multi-Society Task Force report, he got into this whole conversation that there was a lot of discussion that the persistent vegetative, they said the persistent vegetative state is a diagnosis, the permanent vegetative state is a prognosis. So when you determine something is, so I think that they were actually onto that in their thinking, in that distinguishing and moving beyond just the original persistent vegetative state categorization from the 72 Lancet paper. The notion, I think it's helpful, to be aware of conditions that you can't cure or change or alter the trajectory. Because I think there's places where you need to have closure. So understanding somebody's permanent versus vegetative versus minimally conscious is an important distinction. because families might use that information in ways that reflect their values. Okay. Having said that, my earlier roots were in palliative care. So I think that we need to maximize the quality of life for people for whatever time they have remaining. And I've been in the NICU doing ethics consults, and we're talking about a baby who's got days to live. And I will say, you can ask my fellows, I'll say, this is the entirety of the rest of their life. So let's make that as good as it can be. And pain and symptom management, quality of life issues, I think are critical. I did not mean to imply that, but it's really to distinguish people that we can actually, change, therapeutically, alter their state, versus people who have gamma. But the other thing is, a lot of these patients are conflated with people who have degenerative diseases. And the thing about TBI, brain injury, is the worst day of their life is the first day. And they have an upward trajectory potentially to get better, whereas people with degenerative disease have a different trajectory. They can sometimes meet in the middle, and that overlap can be significant. So some of the things that we're learning here might actually have relationship to these other conditions. Although Alzheimer's or something is a systemic disease, or this is a focal disorder, and it may be more difficult to treat a systemic disease than a focal disorder. Thank you.
I want to thank you guys both for a fantastic topic presentation. I'm Chet Moritz, Deputy Director of the Center for Neural Engineering here. I want to zero in on this idea of this therapeutic misconception, especially as it relates to neural device trials. As was pointed out, the model with pharmacology really doesn't apply to devices. The FDA seems to be starting to come along with this concept of early feasibility studies or first-in-human studies where it's not safety that's evaluated, it's not efficacy, it's really about understanding the science by implanting a device in a human participant and working with them to see how it works. And so some of us in our IRBs and our IDEs will actually include specific language that says some experiments to be determined based on the values of the participant. And you'll see that in the example of Jan from the Pittsburgh trial where she's eating a chocolate bar, or the participant at Brown where she's drinking the coffee. That was the image that you showed. And so I think we need to think carefully about what that means. Is it actually bad if the participant is bought into the research and is telling us, you need to increase the stimulus intensity because that relieves my symptoms? Is there an analogy to be made maybe to early pharmaceutical trials, antidepressant trials, where the subject could actually tell you the dosing response? I mean, how else do you know the dosing response if they're not giving you feedback on their symptoms in real time? So it'd be great to have a more open discussion about that. I mean, rather than maybe saying it's a horrible thing, how can we leverage it to actually improve the outcomes for all the people who might benefit?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, and I didn't mean to imply that it's a horrible thing, but just that I think that it is a different model of doing research, and I think that they're both scientific questions. I think, as you were alluding to, right? How does that subject buying in change how we want to measure, but also how we want to think about whatever costs are involved in participating, right? So if there are risks to participating in any study, right? And so there are risks to being an early adopter of this sort of study. And so does being a participant change how we weigh those things, right? Weigh those risks. And I think this is a really important area for exploration. I think hopefully.
So we have we have a brain initiative grant from DBS for a slightly higher population, and we just had a call yesterday. I can't remember where I am. But we were talking about what are the cutoffs, and when do we know whether we've reached a threshold to continue funding and go forward to the next milestone? And that's a very complicated question because, we learn a lot by doing it. John Dewey said you can learn by doing. And Helen Mayberg, you talked with her, and she and I have a paper we're working on now about, what you learn in iterating these trials. And if you think about it, you put these electrodes in, you set your stimulation parameters, and you got to walk away and see what happens. And what will interestingly happen is you might not meet a threshold in the depression trials. Like in the Reclaim study, for example, I've got an editorial in there's neurosurgery coming up in a few months. But the point is that the time constraints were too brief. Some people have a positive hit after the criteria is too late. And then you might get a certain percentage of people who are less than the threshold number. Maybe you need 20% responders. I think, and this is the point of this paper that we're working on, we should look at the 10% and see why they were winners, and then reconvert the losers, right, whatever that means, right, and gets back to your point, and try to reiterate it and learn from what we just discovered. Instead of looking at our failures, look at our successes. And the point for that is you've already invested the time, money, danger, and everything in putting electrodes in these people's brains, and they're indwelling. So it's not like a drug trial where you don't get to give them another dose. It's already there. So why don't we take advantage of that infrastructure that's already in place? The burden has already been imposed. Let's try to find the benefit. The other thing about involving families is that there are metrics now, studies, where we are actually we're interrogating families about what they think they see in their loved one, and it changes the Bayesian pretest probability of the established tests, because they spend more time with the family. So I'm totally with you. And again, I think the Richardson book, even though he's talking about what you do if you're can you treat schistosomiasis in AIDS patients in Africa, if you're there, is different than what we're talking about. I think it's really, to me, it was a fundamentally important book because it reconfigures the dichotomization. And the dichotomization goes back to the research ethics abuses, that we don't want people using you as research fodder. This is a more complicated place. So I totally agree. I don't have the answers, but I think you're asking really important questions.
Yeah, so about this therapeutic misconception of business.
Okay.
Oh, sorry about that. So about all of this stuff about therapeutic misconception, I worry about it. Aaron sort of nodded to me during his comments. What I'm worried about in particular is this idea that we are collaborators, the idea that we are laboring over something. So in my work, I work with Maggie here. We're trying to figure out if somebody can learn to use a chronically implanted VCI with very few channels, and we're trying to figure out if they can use VCI to control brain stimuli. But it really is labor. So learning how to use a VCI is very difficult. And if they don't have the carrot of potential therapeutic benefit, what are they doing it for? But also, when we ask a person to be part of research, some active research, we ask them to do a kind of prognosis, to think about other people with their condition who will have that device later on, and we're using off-the-shelf components, right? So the idea is that this thing is going to be in wide distribution.
You know what, I'm not a big fan of the therapy. I mean, the framework, I think, it was 1982, it's kind of an old idea. I think, so Deborah Matthews, Eric Machina, and I have a paper that's under review now about the therapeutic misconception. And just think about it, if a patient is going to be enrolled in a study, right, that requires an electrode in their brain, and they said, I'm just doing, I don't think it'll help me, and I'm just doing it because I want to help society. And you say, well, okay. Yeah, so I just want to, Mother Teresa has always been a role model. I just want to be, a good citizen, global citizen. I want to help the world, and I really, you begin to wonder about their capacity, right? So is it ever really normal not to have some sense of expectation? I think it's a very, it's a dichotomous kind of category. If you have a therapeutic misconception, you're somehow disqualified from a consent point of view. But I think if you didn't have some expectation, it would raise the question of whether or not you were, truly capacitated. So I think that there's a complexity here that the framework doesn't quite, capture. Having said that, we can be very careful because all the forces are aligned in the other direction. People want to believe it works, but if they didn't believe it could work at all, I think it also raises, other questions.
Last question, Denise.
So I feel like there's a parallel between clinical care and clinical research in terms of in both cases you have hope and expectation. And if you distinguish the two, it can make a difference. Because the therapeutic misconception, it seems to me, is mostly a sort of bug that is held by the clinical researchers that then infects the patients. It's really coming from them. It's the way, no matter what you've written down on a consent form, It's the way they talk about it that makes a difference. And there's nothing wrong in both contexts to me in having both hope and expectation. We worry on the clinical side sometimes that when somebody's hope becomes the expectation and there are no other possibilities, that starts to worry us. And there's something like that happening on the research side as well. And if the researchers themselves, or the clinicians themselves, can be clear in their language with each other and with the patients and their families between here's what we hope for, here are realistic expectations, we have no idea if they're ever going to meet. We want you to hope with us, but making these kinds of distinctions and being really careful in the language, I think starts to correct.
Right. And it may not be something that the same individual can do. You may need to have, may need to have role sequestration, but they have to have role sequestration with somebody that has the same level of perceived power as the investigator. If you have the junior clerk, saying, doing the consent monitoring, but the chief of neurosurgery is the guy who's doing and getting it, it's not going to work. So I think, you're absolutely right, but it may not be compatible in the same individual. And I think you want, getting back to the humanities issue, you want the investigators to be very self-reflective on what exactly they're trying to do. And I think the transparency is very important because it's also important for them because I think you're absolutely right, they suffer from the same disease.
All right, so if you have other questions, please write them down because at the end of the day, we'll bring all the speakers and commentators back and we can have more questions. But thank you, guys. We're going to start up again at, let's say, 11:10, so people have a chance to use the restroom.